our Norskis. I'm the one who was born in Norway. He was born in the United States. The stuff we'll present and show you is going to be a surprise in a lot of ways. And it's only about half the story. We're working on another presentation also. I was born in Norway. I'm a Second World War child. I was born in 1942. The war was already underway. And my parents immigrated to the United States in 1947. And when we asked our dad, why did you leave Norway? And he said, Russaren kommer next. He said, the Russians are coming next. A lot more to the story, and we'll develop that as it goes along. Peter was born here, and he grew up as 13 years younger than me. I'm 80, so you know how old he is. But he just retired from Valley City State as a chairman of the tech ed department. And I'm proud. I'm going to introduce him and say that about a year ago, he was recognized as the outstanding tech ed teacher in the United States. Wow. He never fusses about him. It's Pete for me, and it should be Dr. Gjovik, but that's, anyway, neither here nor there.
I've met too many doctors in my life at the university level that were fun to work with. So I decided that I just try to keep it.
Yeah, we're going to show some slides and do a presentation that evolves around my childhood. People don't realize the impact the Norwegians had on the world and on the impact they had on the Second World War coming to an end. Two parts to the story. We'll present the first part of it, and you'll hear a little bit about the second part, which is even more momentous and eventful. I was born upstairs in Knaben, midwife. My grandparents lived in the home with my mother and dad, and I had my uncle and a grandfather and another uncle also there. I don't understand how they did it, but we all seem to have our space. My memory of Norway is my first life. I was almost 6 years old when we came to this country. And from the time I was 6 until about the 7th or 8th grade, I don't really remember much. But I remember very distinctly and very clearly events from 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. I remember a lot of stuff. And just to prove the point, when I went back with my parents to Norway for the first time, we were driving through the country going to where I was from supposedly, and I said, there's Knarkniden. There's the top of the mountain where I was born. And my mother said, oh no, what a place, you're crazy, that's not good. You know, about a mile and a half, there it was. You know, childhood memories, they stay with you. And I always thought it was awfully tall, but not that big. My reason and our reason for giving this presentation is because of Knaben, Norway is a significant part of world history. How many of you heard Knaben before? K-N-A-B? Never heard of it. Have anybody watched the Memphis Belle, the movie? Never heard of it. At the beginning of that movie, about some bomber pilots flying out of England, in the background you see the missions they're on, and on that list of names, one of them is Knaben. was a critical point for the Nazis when they invaded Norway. And it was pretty easy for them because Norwegian and German is the same sprache, same language, Germanic. Easy for them to move in. The reason they moved in was because Knaben was the location of a molybdenum mine. Everybody knows what molybdenum is, right?
No.
My dad said it was molybdenum. That was the Norwegian way of saying it. It's an alloy that is extracted from, Peter's got an example of it, we'll pass it around, that was critical to the Nazi war machine, because if you mix molybdenum with steel, it gives a tremendous tensile strength. That's why the Panzer tanks were almost impenetrable. There were 2 mines in the world, one in South Africa and one in Knaben. The number one site, the number one reason for the Nazis at that point in time to invade Norway was Knaben. Isolated southern part of Norway, as you can see right down here. Nobody really knew anything about it. It's done pretty well after the war. Now it's a ski resort. But we can click the next picture. This is the foundation of the house that I was born in. My uncle built a new home on top of it. That foundation is rocks 3 feet thick. I mean, it's solid. That is Gjovik, and that's the point I said, that's Gjovik, and that. My parents said, you youngster, you don't know. That shows some of the foundation, and here's on top of the mountain, walking up. You can walk from my home place up the mountain on top, and there's, I think that's my family, some of my family members to the top of the mountain. Really an interesting location. My older brother, his name was Peder, Aanen, and my sister is Gjovik. Nice names. My brother hated his name so much that he changed it to Lloyd. And it's a beautiful Norwegian name. And I've always stood up for mine. And I kind of look around. The first, when I got married, she was from Edmore, North Dakota, and the first name in the phone book was Aanen Aanensen. And I said, yeah. Well, let's take a look at that. Next slide. I'll get Peter talking. He knows more about this stuff than I do. No. This is a picture of the mine. And my dad worked in forced labor with his brother-in-law, with his brother, with his father, and my other grandfather. Forced labor for 5 years. Why? They upped the volume of production in that molybdenum mine and shipped it directly to Germany. They were there just within a few days of the occupation of Norway. They were there. And what did we say? We looked and there was 1,000 troops?
1,000 troops in Knaben.
Yeah.
But what really is, to me, is interesting is it took 400,000 Nazi troops to control Norway, a population of 4 million. So there was 1 Nazi soldier for every 10 civilians in Norway during the war. What you gotta realize is, in Norway, every able-bodied person had mandatory military service. So, in true Norwegian fashion, when they realized that, or were starting to get worried about that the Nazis were going to possibly invade Norway, they sent out mobilization orders by mail. And by the time the letters got there, it was all over. Because it took like 3 days. And northern Norway, the fight went on for quite a while, but southern Norway was overrun in a matter of 2 to 3 days.
Clicker. Nazi occupation. The King of Norway, King Haakon, who was Danish, their family escaped narrowly into Sweden, eventually and some to the United States. And how many of you seen The King's Choice?
Really good movie.
It's a very, very good movie that dramatically shows, and Norway is working very hard these days at doing movie pictures as realistically and as accurately and as chronologically as they possibly can. They're well done. If you ever get a chance, if you got, well, most of us haven't now, but just look on the search and look up King's Choice. That's a very, very well done presentation on some of the dynamics in the Second World War. We've got documentation that the Germans said, number one, Knaben, for a point of attack. War ended in 45, we're gonna fill in a lot of that stuff in between. The interesting part of it is that the king said that if the people didn't give up, they would stay in power, and if they gave up, they would cede their authority. That's incredible. People didn't realize that, but that's part of the awareness that they had.
The Norwegian cabinet was really leaning towards cooperating with the Nazis, and Haakon VII and his son, the Crown Prince Olaf, they met with them and said, you can do what you want, but if you cooperate, if we don't fight the Nazis, we abdicate the throne. We quit. And at that point, they decided then that they were going to try to fight.
So, that kind of sets the tone for what ensues. This shows some of the graffiti by the Norwegians against the Nazis. Leave, it means long live Haakon VII. And that incensed the Nazis, really irritated them. We know now that many of our family members were in the underground. One of the funny things that we've heard is, you know, my dad's name was Leif. L-E-I-V, pronounced Leif. He said, Leif Gjovik, he was the best marksman in the community. Well, you know, they would go out at night hunting because we were rationed. Flour, sugar, and that's about it. They took sheep or pigs or cattle, whatever they needed, they took it. And my dad and his uncles, and my uncle would go out at night hunting. I didn't see him come back with very much. The reason for that. Knaben is in Kvinesdal Valley, and there's Åseral and Sirdal valleys on the other side over the mountains, and that's where they'd go and do whatever they did. So that if they were captured, they were not held responsible by the community.
They wouldn't be recognized as anybody from the community.
No.
So they would meet each other going into each other's valleys to do resistance work and cause issues for the Nazis. And Dad, one other thing about that, Dad had a rifle, but he never had it all in one piece until he would march out, he'd reassemble his rifle, and when he came back, he'd disassemble it and hide parts of it So when, by the time he got home, he never had a rifle.
They searched our place many times. Never searched the eavesdrops. Gunny sacks, oiled gunny sacks is where the rifles were in the rain gutters. They never found them. Some of the children in the community contributed. Now my brother Lloyd, or Hjemdahl, and Augie, his cousin, they were rascals. The German communication systems were just like electrical lines now, but they had them plugged together.
And laying right alongside the road.
Side the road.
And the roads were blasted out of the mountains, so each rock was like a knife, right? So what do you think these guys did when they were going to school in the morning?
And walked up. And then, you know, it's hard to determine where's the break.
6-year-old kids,
Yeah.
5-year-old kids.
You got stories to tell about those.
Can we tell them one other story about them? There's a story in the family about the blonde Mauser. The Mauser was a rifle that the Nazis used. At the end of the war, when the Nazis knew they were losing, they had a personnel vehicle. They were coming down the road by the barn, and Augie and Lloyd threw nails out the road and blew a tire. These 4 Nazis get out, and they're as drunk as skunks because the morale was gone, and they knew they were losing, and they were inebriated. So they took their 4 Mausers and they stacked them up in a pyramid, went over to the other side of the vehicle to change the tire. These 2 boys come running out and grab the blonde Mauser. It was one that had a white stock on it, really weird. Takes it, and they run up into the mountain, and they hide it. And they come back down and say, Far, Dad, we stole a Mauser from the Nazis. Oh, you boys, you're that aren't taste. That's just nonsense. And pretty soon he got to the point, he says, you know, maybe there is something there. Well, you better show me. And this was about May, so the war was just about done, but there was still a little snow on the ground. And as he was going up there, and they said, this is where we hid the rifle. There's no rifle there, but there's adult-sized footprints in the snow that's left. So what do you think Dad's thinking? You boys get out of here now. Go. Run. Go. Get out of here. And nothing ever comes of it. So about 2-3 weeks later, the war ends. All of a sudden, all the Norwegian in the community are just armed to the hilt. They're sitting there shooting rifles in the air. And all of a sudden, I think it was Little Ola, the neighbor, Little Oli, up the road, standing there with the blonde Mauser. Lloyd, my brother, looks at him, goes like that, and he just laughs. He'd watched the whole thing, then he went and stole the Mauser.
The sequence of events is that my brother was in the United States Air Force, went back up to Norway, and during his trip to Norway, he went up to see some of the neighbors, and he walks into Little Ola's house, and there's the Mauser.
Unreal.
And he just laughed at Lloyd. There's another story. Irene, we think some 10, 11, 12 years old. She was a courier for the underground. She'd go by the Germans. These Gjovik girls were pretty girls, and boy, they'd drive by. Anyway, she was carrying messages back and forth from the underground during the whole war.
10 to 12 years old.
Yeah.
Riding right under their noses on her bike. It's just a little local girl.
We know that Dad and Lars and Knut were in the underground. My dad's brother Knut, they worked in the mine. And if you wanna, do we need to click that this time? Snow Treasure is another movie that you can watch true about
Kids.
kids.
When, right at the point where the Nazis had taken over Norway, there was a lot of gold bullion that the Norwegian government had, and they had to get it out of the country because they did not want the Nazis to get a hold of it. So, and it's a true story. These kids had their sleds, and they would go sleigh riding after school every day, and they would have their pack, and it looked like it was just a cushion, but there was 4 to 5 bars of solid gold on each pack, and they would slide right by the Nazis, right under their noses. And they had one that they used to joke about, called him Sergeant Sit Down, because he couldn't stand up on skis. Okay.
This is interesting. This is myself, Pete, my sister Chella, and aunt. And this is in Norway. We went back to see her. She was in a nursing home at the time. But she's married to my godfather, Lars, and was a school teacher. And guess what she taught? English. Yeah, she was very fluent. This stove is very much like the stove that was in our house in Knaben. And that stove was sitting on top of a kind of little rock, and you could turn the rock, shortwave radio underneath. During the whole war, got away with it. And I remember one time when I thought my mother was going to die of fright. He'd been out hunting, and on top of this stove there was a grid, not like you see here, but you know, grid was open. One of the bird's feathers, all balloon, one of the feathers was sticking out at the top. When they came to search the house, and they came in. My mother, I was standing behind, hanging on my mom's leg, and she was just shaking. Never saw it. To me, it was just a pure miracle. Because if they'd have seen that, they know there's guns, they'd have shot the whole family. No questions asked.
One other thing in that same house, our Uncle Knut, Dad's brother, had a German
Short hair.
Or wire hair. And this German dog hated Nazis. And it was the early warning system, because it could hear, they had cleats on their boots, and when they'd come walking, marching down the road, the dog would be growling long before they showed up at the house.
The ordinary soldiers did, it was a Gestapo. Metal on their heels and their toes went, and the dog moved a quarter mile away. Boom. You know they're coming.
Start growling.
And I'll tell you more about the pastor there. But more than once, my brother and I slept in the same bed, and we slept crossways in it. More than once, middle of the night, they would search the houses, knock the door, kick the door. You hear the dog barking, and it was just chaos. Up the stairs, kick the door open, and here, I mean, I'm 3, 4 years old. My brother is 3 years older than I, and machine guns pointed at us. So we're going to die. More than once. And I've used that illustration as I'm a retired pastor. I've used that as a sermon illustration. I had nightmares when we came to the United States for a long time afterwards. And that was the recurring dream. And I distinctly remember one morning, the dream was there, and I consciously or unconsciously or whatever looked up, and I said to the soldiers in Norwegian, "Go shoot, go ahead and shoot. God's going to take care of me." Never had the nightmare again. That's a true story. Yeah. This is the first pastor that I remember. And he was thought to be in the underground, so they tortured him pulled out his fingernails, cut his back open, put salt in, castrated him, and trampled him to death. Now, we thought that on one of my trips with my sister taught French and German over the internet for many years, 30 years out of the Dakota Prairie, for students in eastern and western North Dakota. And every other year, she would take her students on a tour of Germany, France, Switzerland, and the last year, before she retired, we asked her, could we go with? My wife and I, oh, sure, so we went with. One of the sites we visited was Dachau. Concentration camp. And I'll never forget it, because I was, after I got inside, it says freedom workers. Was the emblem on the gate. And inside was some of the actual buildings. I was so upset after I got in there, I couldn't have because it sterilized it. It was clean, tidy, nothing, you know. But you know what I ran across? Our pastor was in that camp. They had pictures of as many people as they could get a hold of and photograph. We ended up in Dachau, and then he was sent back to Norway, apparently, after he thought he was gone, and ended up in the concentration camp that the Germans had for the Norwegians in Oslo. What was it? Molegarden, yeah. And that's where he was released from. And the stories that I'd seen and we've read did not show that he was in Germany. We know for a fact he was, because we've seen his picture in the concentration camp. So there was quite a dedicated saint, I'll tell you. What had an impact on us and my sister and my brother was the fact that they wanted to eliminate that source of molybdenum. British and English and American pilots bombed us. The first time they tried, how many did they lose?
They came in with 10, the British came in with mosquito bombers, and they came in low. And Dad told me the story. He said, we always knew that if Norwegians showed up talking different dialects, we better look to the sky, because something was up. And all the anti-aircraft in that first bombing was set for high altitude. And these guys came in treetop right down the valley. And that was the day that Dad called in sick and missed his first day of work in 2.5 years. I don't feel like going to work, Mom said. You haven't missed a day of work in 2.5 years. His crew was killed. He was the foreman. Mom always said it was divine intervention. We found out afterwards, the comment was made by a family member, we could not afford for him to be there.
He was a foreman and in charge of drilling and explosives in the mine. And ultimately had an impact on the atomic bomb. Norway had deuterium oxide produced at a hydro plant in Telemarken, Rjukan, and the Germans took that heavy water, were using it to produce and make the atomic bomb. They had that information available. That's another story. But my dad said, these guys would come in, we didn't know who they were, and we trained them in explosives, all of a sudden they were gone.
He knew 9 of the 11 saboteurs that we'll be talking about at Rubicon here in a little bit.
They blew the place up. But anyway, that's another story. Mosquito bombers, Peter and I had an interesting discussion. He said, no, they couldn't have been Lancaster or American because they had fins on the back. The tail had fins on the back like this. I said, I remember, I can still see them, because when the plane came in, it was twin fuselage plane, and it was wings like this, and my dad running out of the barn and saying, Hjemdahl, make them to this basement immediately, screaming at the top. Never seen my dad say like that before. You knew it was coming. You could hear the plane, and the pilot looked and waved and stopped. And then you hear, the roar. And, 130 bombers. And through the discussion, I said, it must have been Lancasters. No, what were
They're Mitchells. B-24.
B-24.
B-25 Mitchells. They were American planes.
Yeah.
So that's like, I'm kind of the nerd when it comes to the U.S. military airplanes. They grew up really
He
interested.
just didn't believe me. And I said, no.
Well, they weren't Lancasters,
No.
but they did have twin tails.
They
like
had
you
twin
said.
tails. Yeah, I mean, I can still see it clearly. But can you imagine that? I lay between my grandmother and my grandfather, and they were shaking and I was shaking, the house was shaking, all the windows in the house were broken.
This is 3 miles away from the mine.
And it wasn't like one bomb, it was just a solid vibration and noise that was unbelievable. Can you imagine in a small area like you saw? That's where all the bombs were. And when they got done, if they didn't use up their ordnance, we have a cousin down the valley, he released this. They dropped the bombs on top of a mountain there, and to this day, there is not any lichen or any growth at all on top
No
of that
trees.
mountain. It's a huge area.
Just
Just-
rock. That's all that's left. Killed
just-
everything.
It's just gone. There is go ahead.
Well, this picture right here, Aanen had mentioned the Memphis Belle. To help the war effort, they had a policy, if you flew 25 bomber missions and survived 25 missions, you would get shipped back to the United States to sell at war bonds and this sort of thing. So the Memphis Belle was a plane that hit 25 missions, and they did a movie about it. But this knockout dropper airplane was the first plane to get 50 missions, and its 50th mission was bombing Knaben. So they were there, and this pilot was from Minneapolis, a guy by the name of Aanen.
And I have an interesting story to add on to that. When I was a pastor at Brookings, I did a presentation for the VFW in Brookings one evening and explained what I knew about it. And it was well received. And afterwards, a gentleman came up to me and he said, he shook my hand and said, well, I said, I know the story is true. He said, I was one of the pilots. He was from Alma, South Dakota. And I met a retired, well, he was a member of the church, Kurt Stensland, and I said, you know any of these people that are pilots and whatever? Yeah, so he located a couple, and I have their burial obituaries. And they flew in Mount Knaben. They were part of the people that bombed us. But this is what's amazing to me. 1,000 soldiers. You know, what would you say?
Couple hundred miners, maybe?
Yeah. Imagine that. Well, they came in the first time, valley is deep, mine is up at the end, they flew treetop level, they couldn't put the aircraft guns down, they were shooting at nothing. They didn't lose a plane, went right through, bombed them. And, the time that I remember, it was, that my dad said, Ingen, mail a day, nothing bigger than that left. It was completely pulverized. My uncle Knut, we'll see some pictures of him, maybe we should move on. He was working in the mine, and the sirens went off, and he ran to get out of the mine, and he's looking out the opening, and he can see the bomb coming, and there's a smelter to his left, and he rolled behind that smelter and saved his life. He spit black soot for a month afterwards. But he survived. He survived.
There was a notation about Russian POWs on that last page, last slide, and I just have to show you this. I went to Norway the first time in 1967, and my grandma Dorte gave food and gave bread to the Russian POWs that would be going by and working on the road. And one of the POWs made this children's toy, and originally it had a weight or a washer on it, and as it would swing around, these little chicken and a rooster would peck. And she gave me this in 1967. We had an interesting conversation with our cousins one deer season that came over from Norway, and they were saying, I wonder what happened to those 3 toys that the Russian POWs gave to Grandma. And I said, well, I don't know about the other 2, but I got one of them, and it's mine. So you can pass that around. That was made by a POW.
I found since that, looked through the information, and you know how bad it is in Ukraine. Been there, done that. But interestingly enough, the Russian POWs, my grandmother, I was there when she went out to the road and said, and she had boiled eggs and boiled potatoes. And there were 3 of them, and they came in and sat down at the grandma's kitchen table, and they peeled the shells on the eggs, threw them on the floor. And they peeled the potatoes and put the peelings on the floor. No. I never realized until years later when I asked my folks about that, and they said, well, at the mine, they had a big cafeteria, and that's what they did with everything. They threw it on the floor. If they didn't eat it, then they hosed it off with power hoses, water. That's what they were conditioned to. Now, those POWs were well taken care of and appreciated by the Norwegian citizenry. Prove the point, we have a picture, I don't know if it's on here.
I don't think it's in the screen.
Yeah, a picture of, let's see, last name was Yekashenko, but he was a Russian POW that came back to say thank you to the people in Knaben. You know where he was from? Kiev. He was Ukrainian. He came back and expressed his appreciation. I don't know if he's the one that did that, the stuff for grandma. It is interesting. Those people, you think about what they've gone through. If they didn't do what they were supposed to, they shot them. And we know as a matter of fact that Stalin, when the Russian POWs came back to Russia, they were either sent to the gulags or executed.
They were never supposed to be captured.
Never supposed to surrender. If you didn't surrender, you shot. That's the truth of the matter. A lot of that's going on right now.
Yeah, I think we pretty well.
Yeah. The community doesn't really like to talk about it anymore. we've gone back to tour the mine, and you think, well, it's not very big. 19 stories. My dad said it was getting to the point, you were down so low that you'd go down for 2 hours, and then they had to take you up from heat exhaustion, because it was hot down that morning. And the mine was closed in 1972. My uncle Lars, my godfather, when he was 15 years old, he went to work in the Peter calls him the assayer's office, but the head chemist at the mine. And he stayed with him. He graduated from University of Oslo, and the war was over. My uncle Lars was the man who ran the mine in Knappen. He was the head chemist. So they stayed with him. Now, the picture that you have here is something that we'd like to develop for another presentation, because there were people who my dad ended up showing explosives and how to use them. And they went in and blew up the heavy water plant. The bottom floor is where the heavy water was, and heavy water deuterium oxide. We had quite a discussion. I said, well, it's H3O. No, it's different. Well, we looked it up, and hydrogen and deuterium it's the same thing, but hydrogen with another isotope is called deuterium. So it's heavier than normal water. It's safe to drink, but you don't want to drink
small
too much.
quantities.
Yeah. And the reason that this is so important is because deuterium oxide is what is used to cool off radioactive rods in production of the atomic bomb.
When they were doing their research on
And we won't say anything more about it, but there's a lot to that story.
But the same day as that second bombing, there was one large group of aircraft that left England, and they got over Norway, southern Norway, and they split. Half of them went to bomb Knappen, the other half went right here to Rjukan to take this plant out. And if you ever remember a 1960s movie called The Heroes of Telemark, I don't know if you ever saw it, Kirk Douglas and Richard Harris. That movie was based on this, and it's very loosely based on what really happened. You know, it's a Hollywood movie. But the Norwegians, as he had mentioned, are doing new movies now to really tell the story, and they have a 6-part series called The Heavy Water War that was actually on Netflix a couple of years ago.
Take a look at
And it's an outstanding account of what happened. It is very, very close to every book I've read about it.
One of the stories that my father tells about that, he watched the Kirk Douglas all this. He wasn't real impressed with it because it wasn't factually accurate. Well, he did say that in one of the sequences, when they had blown up the plant and they were trying to escape, one of the German soldiers would not, he was good on skis. This one farmer just was going and going. I don't know, it was hours that he chased him, and he couldn't shake it. So he jumped over a point, came down, and he shot him. He's a bronze medalist in the Olympics. And
But
the
he
farmer
couldn't catch a normal.
couldn't catch the farmer on his skis. The Norwegians are quite proud of that.
This was big enough of importance that there were actually 4 different actions trying to take that out. Originally, the British were going to send in 2 commando teams, and they were going to use gliders, and things went bad. One of the gliders crashed. One of them was lost over the ocean. A few of them survived. Of course, they were executed. And before that, there was a group of 3 or 4 of these Norwegians that were supposed to go in ahead up on the high plateau of the Hardangervidda and put flares out so they knew where to land. And of course, they crashed, and the weather was so bad, they didn't get any supplies all winter. They lived on top of a mountain with no food. for an entire winter. It got so bad, they were to the point they were scraping lichen off of rocks, melting snow, and trying to make a soup out of it to try to get some kind of nourishment. So they went up, strapping strong guys, and they came out just shadows of themselves. But they survived. That was the first action. Then the commandos came in and blew it up. Then they came in and tried to bomb it. And this valley is so steep. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of it, but to get sunlight into the town square, they have a mirror on top of the mountain to shine light down so they can get some sunlight in the middle of the winter. Because the sun never comes over the mountain. And at the end then, they bombed it, that didn't work, and then the Nazis said, well, we don't want to fight this fight anymore, so we're going to take whatever we have in heavy water in barrels, and we're going to take it to Germany, because they already had an installation set up where they could make their own heavy water. And the Nazis were everything was on a schedule. Well, that worked very well for the commandos because they waited until the Norsk Hydro, which had all of these barrels, which was a ship for ferrying trains and cars and this sort of thing. They timed it so they sunk it in the deepest part of the fjord, 1,200 feet deep.
Women and children involved, and they knew they had to do it.
And the order came from the king. You talk about collateral damage. I've read some accounts where they knew some of the people that were on the boat. Now think about that. Happened to be that person. Knut Haukeli was one of them.
You got any more, Peter?
No, I think we're getting long-winded here.
You've got questions?
Were they, the forced labor, were they paid their regular salaries?
No.
No?
No. You're given rations and, survival. Sugar and flour. I tell some, give us illustrations. When I was a little kid, the soldiers were going by our place. The road was right next to our house. And they'd ride by in their trucks, and the soldiers would get good food. But when they were served bread and sandwiches, they'd eat the white part of the bread, and they'd take the crust and throw it to the village dogs and bet which dog would get the most. We knew the dogs. I survived on white bread, and it is interesting because I'm allergic to rye, and that's the kind of flour that we would serve. Allergic to it. Very allergic to it, to say the least. But, you never know. These guys think they were harassing. They were feeding the kids. My mother hated it, but my dad said, "Well, let them feast up. Let them eat. Let them eat." And that's what my dad said.
Probably should tell this story here about the German pointer when the Nazi soldier came in the middle of the night. This is the one that we said didn't like Nazis, right?
Well, the same dog, whatever, and the dog was he was good sized, like this, about the size of a lamb, I suppose, but vicious looking, nice dog. What was the term you said that was
Basically, the soldier came into the room and the dog met him like this, right in his face. And everything's good here.
Yeah, alles gut, I remember saying
Alles
that.
gut.
He said, alles gut, and left.
Slammed the door and left.
Everything's good, and left. Alles gut. He must have known something about dogs, because he's familiar. I'll never forget that, he's alles gut. Yeah.
The interesting thing about Knut was, he was in port in Norway when the war broke out, and there were a lot of Norwegian sailors that were all over the planet when the war broke out, which will feed into when we talk about the 99th Battalion. But he was very fluent, or conversational in quite a few languages. I don't know how many he said that he spoke. 9 languages. But he was the interpreter for the Russian POWs. At the mine.
He was recognized as a friend of Stara of Norway because of his teaching folk dancing, and awarded a medal by the king for his activities. The interesting, he played guitar, Spanish guitar, I don't know, more strings than how to explain it, but
Just acoustic.
yeah, and he was quite a singer and a storyteller, and he was the community, what should we say, big implement, fishermen.
Knut's gonna go into fish there, right?
Yeah, it's
Knut, you're gonna go out and fish?
a neighbor boy, yeah. He was, these are stupid stories, but he would go fishing, and he had a little one-cylinder diesel that he ran, and he would steer, the thing was in the back, and the seagulls landed right on his boat. And if you turned too sharp, they would lift their leg and go over the paddle, whatever you call it, steering mechanism.
The tiller.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, Lars, he mentioned he was the chemist at the mine, also very heavily in the underground. He basically, I'd really like you to tell this story because Christmas is coming. And Aanen has been our pastor a couple times over in different communities. And I always love hearing this story about the oranges.
Well, he was a good athlete, cross country and ski jumping. If it wouldn't have been for the war, he would have been in the Olympics. He was that good. But when I was tiny, and I look back at Christmas, how many of you remember the first Christmas present you ever got? I do. Usually, my mother would sew mittens or socks or a cap or a sweater or something. She sewed what's over there. Knit. I got a sack, paper sack, brown paper sack. And Lars gave it to me and said, it's for you, man. Here, on the foot, you've got to share it with others. I didn't know what it was. So everybody I opened mine, and you know what I had? Half a dozen oranges.
In the middle of the war.
How in heaven's name did he get those oranges? So he must have been in the pantry or something up there. But I see those oranges. Whenever I eat an orange, I remember my first Christmas present. Pretty special. Now, they were really good. Must come from Florida or something. I don't know, but they were good. Let's see, what else? Questions? You must have. We settled, when we came to the United States, my dad got a letter from his uncle at Pekin, North Dakota, Raleigh Ensted country. And you know Raleigh? Electrician, anyway, great guy. But, Dad left on short notice because his his uncle in North Dakota had a stepson that was supposed to farm for him, because my uncle, our dad's uncle, was dying, he was very ill. And he said, if any of your children wanna come over here and take over the farm, when I'm gone, they can have it. My mother and dad left at 2 weeks' notice to Pekin, North Dakota. My dad didn't even know how to milk a cow. Or run a tractor. He knew how to move rocks. He was good at it.
And there was lots of rocks on that farm. It was sandy soil. I wasn't very old. I'll interject one thing. Lloyd and Aanen were doing a landscaping project at the farm and building this wall of fieldstone and, you know, granite and this sort of thing. And sitting there and hitting it with sledgehammers, trying to get it to split so you get a nice shiny surface, this sort of thing. And basically creating shrapnel and putting your eye out and this sort of thing. And Dad comes walking along and says, what are you trying to do? Well, we're trying to split these rocks. Give me the hammer. Just takes a little hammer. They're using sledgehammers, right? Gives him a little hammer and he goes, whoop, and falls right in half. The guy knew stone.
Got to know the grain. Sit up. Yeah.
Didn't reach the grain.
His word was, it touches less all. You don't have to hit it so hard. On this picture, if I took this back to Pekin, North Dakota, now people would say, "You've got to be kidding me. Lake Gjovik on a motorcycle?" Yeah, that's my Uncle Lars, godfather, and that's my dad. They bought motorcycles. They were, you know, had gainful employment before the war started, and they were doing okay. And that was gone. My dad's motorcycle existed after the war. So took it apart and put it in the hayloft. Hid it in the hay. During the whole war.
War ended, put it back together again and put some gas in and off he went.
It had a sidecar. I was in the right in the sidecar.
So what year did you guys
Pardon?
come, what year did your dad, your parents bring you guys over here?
1947, about a year after the war was over. Yeah, a little over a year.
2 years.
Yeah, and I couldn't speak a word of English. I have an F on my report card. That's a good story. Ruth Martinson, wonderful teacher. Reading circle, we had a sandbox in the schoolroom, but then had a piece of plywood, and then we had to sit around and read. Dick and Jane and Spot and Sally. And we were reading, and then it came my turn, and she said, "Read louder." So I read lower. She said, "Aanen, read louder." I read lower. She said, "Third time, I just quit reading." Tell you what. Dunn's cap in the corner, disobedient. The grade came out. My dad went up to my uncle in Pekin and said, "Here's the report cards. You tell us how the kids are doing." And he looked at all of them and he said, "Oh," he said, "Aanen's no problem." She said, "He can't read. I got F in reading." My dad said, "I thought he reads pretty good." They said, "What?" So he arranged to have a meeting with Ruth Martinson about my F. And I was sitting on a chair, my parents in front, and Ruth is Martinson's a Norwegian. She understands Norwegian. You know, they're sitting there and they're talking, trying to figure it out. And finally my dad, he said, he said, "I know what it is." She said, "What?" The word for lower in Norwegian is louder. Louder, louder, louder. I thought she was telling me to read lower. I still have the F. If I ever,
Just, you know, you find out things. Tom Brokaw wrote a book about the Greatest Generation. And it's just a wonderful book. Just short stories about people that contributed and helped in the war effort. But you know, the greatest generation wasn't just military in the United States. It was people in countries like Norway that were totally overrun but didn't give up the fight. And Mom made Dad promise that he wasn't going to be involved in the underground. You have family, you have kids, you can't be involved. Oh, no, I wasn't going to be involved. And one time, Knut and Dad and Mom were visiting. And Dad and Knut started talking about some underground action that happened, and Mom, oh, dude, they come there, I'm not nice. You don't know anything about that. That's just nonsense. And Uncle Knut goes, oh, Anna, if you only knew, he could write a book. So he was, and you know, knowing him, I still can't get my head wrapped around it. Because knowing him, he was just a quiet, peaceful man.
He took care of everybody and everybody loved him.
Yep. But you don't invade my country, apparently. So, I just found this out not too long ago. He was honored with climbing the flagpole in his hometown of Peder, Norway, after the Nazis left to put the Norwegian flag back up again. He was that type of an athlete. He was a pole vaulter. He could go over 10 feet with a bamboo pole. And it can't be easy. I couldn't do it with a ladder. Anyway.
Questions? We just want to just a lot of stuff that is
Information overload, I'm afraid.
yeah, it probably is. But when you hear the next story, the Jew who helped the Nazis almost make the atomic bomb, you'd be amazed.
I've always heard that Norway was occupied and never conquered.
That's a
So I've
true statement.
I've been heard that through family stories since I was old. Yeah.
Yep. Oh, they didn't make, you know, when it takes 400,000 Nazi soldiers to control 4 million civilians, there's something going on. You know? Yeah. This is an interesting part of U.S. history. We had an Uncle Ud Stark who married my dad's sister Lydia after he was stationed in Norway after the Nazis had surrendered. Ud Stark was a member of the 99th Infantry Battalion, a U.S. Army unit that the pre-qualification to get into this unit is you had to be able to speak Norwegian. And they had several, there was a Greek unit like that, you know, but they originally, the plan was they were going to train them, drop them into Norway, and then they were going to work with the underground and just cause chaos. There was also some talk about trying to retake Europe through Norway, which I couldn't imagine with those mountains and valleys would have been really difficult. So they came up with the D-Day invasion, went into Normandy, and the 99th then came in 2 weeks after D-Day and found themselves right in the middle of the Canal Drive and then the Battle of the Bulge. So they were right in the thick of it. He was in Malmedy. And he was in a group of soldiers that was told, you fight to the last man, you buy us all the time you can get. They didn't expect to survive. And he was one who came up. Tough little nut. Here you see, one of his jobs when he went to Norway was to be an interpreter for the Norwegians to the U.S. Army officers that didn't speak Norwegian that came in. And as you can see here, he's giving a proper salute to Der Führer. It was a staged photo by the U.S. Army. So that's Uncle Ud, you know.
We have had two odd uncles. Gjovik and Stark.
No. But what was interesting here, you know, they came into Norway, they supervised the Nazis as they were getting escorted out of the country, to put it nicely. But you can see the Viking ship patch. They got the same training as the 10th Mountain Division, Camp Hale, in Colorado. And you know, you hear about all the stories about the Camp Hale, or the 10th Mountain guys that started all the ski areas, and like Bowerman, that's the shoe guy, and all this sort of thing. But guess who holds all the endurance and speed records for skiing? It's the 99th guys. Now, one other thing, there were actually Norwegian citizens that were accepted into this U.S. Army unit, because a lot of them got stranded in New York, out on the West Coast in harbors, and the war came out, and they came up, and the U.S. Army took them. We got the unit for you. You can really speak Norwegian. Sent them off to boot camp, and there they go.
I was at his funeral in Seattle. He was the chauffeur when Quisling, who's the traitor, was executed. He was the chauffeur.
Quisling is kind of the Benedict Arnold of Norway.
From what we understand family-wise, he was the most decorated soldier in the 99th Battalion. I was out there for the funeral, and the honor guard, what is it, military base in Seattle. Anyway, the commanding officer read the honor guard, his dossier and so forth, and when they carried him in, there wasn't a dry eye. They were all
This plaque is in a little community in Belgium during the canal drive. He'd just gotten through with a pretty nasty series of fighting, and he came through a cafe and sat down and had a bottle of wine and relaxed a little bit. And in that cafe, to this day, they've got a plaque, because he's had a postcard from this and sent it back to family. And here they have his face, his image etched in stone. And the people in, well, Holland and Belgium and all over Europe were so thankful for what the U.S. did to help free them again. Which reminds me, I'm sorry, we're getting long-winded here, but in '67 I got a chance to go to Norway for the first time, and I was 12 years old, and it was the height of the Vietnam War. 67, right? And we were sitting down at a real fancy sit-down Sunday dinner at my Aunt Margie's, the dad's sister. And a bunch of her college-age kids and their friends came, and they saw that the relatives from the United States were there, and they immediately started in on the United States and how evil they were about in Vietnam. And Dad was a very quiet man, but I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden I see his hand go like this. And he started turning red, and I went, ooh, this is going to be good. He comes up like this, and he pounds his hit, you know, and I mean, he was a hard rock miner, so he had good, strong hands, and he hit that table so hard the water was splashing out of the glasses, the silverware was rattled. Enough! That's enough. If it wasn't for the United States, you'd all be talking German right now. And that was the end of the bashing of the United States. That was it. Done. Okay.
More stuff? Oh, okay. Oh, this is interesting here. Peter K. sheep farmer. This is a boat we came with, USS Marine Jumper. Looked it up after just within the last few years. This boat was a troop transport, military troop transport along the United States. And after the war was over, I mean, it served in the Mediterranean and Atlantic, whatever. They converted it over to a, what do you call it, a container ship?
Yeah.
and it became the USS Panama. And in 1972, it was sold for scrap. But that's just an add-on. Here's my other odd uncle.
Dad's brother,
Yeah.
youngest brother.
And this is me, Kellogg, David Flooring. I'll bet there's people here who know him. Yeah. And my dad. And this is my mom and dad. Here's Pekin, North Dakota, a baseball guy. Spent a lot of time there.
I'm gonna say one more thing about Dad, and Odd met a young nursing student from Gjovik, North Dakota, Norma Mutter. Does that sound like a cook German to you? And Norma came up to me at Dad's funeral, which was a little over 20 years ago, and she said, Pete, I just want you to know how special your dad was to me. So when I started dating Odd, the siblings back in Norway found out that he was dating a German girl. And this didn't go over real well. They were really pitching a fit. And Dad, in true oldest son fashion, writes a scathing letter back to the siblings in Norway. Norma Muller is one of the finest women I have ever met in my life. I'll be proud to call her my sister-in-law. You knock this off now. That was the end of it. In the 60s, Odd and Norma went back to Norway. Well, guess what? She became the favorite sister-in-law. They absolutely loved her.
She learned to speak Norse.
Yeah.
That's German, Norwegian.
And Norma's still with us. She lives in Grand Forks. Amazing, amazing.
Yeah. Was your dad the oldest brother?
Yeah.
He seemed to really have the upper hand when you listened to him.
Pardon, I didn't hear it.
Your dad sounds like he had the upper hand and people really respected him.
You know, that's kind of the Norwegian way. The oldest son kind of makes the calls. I mean, basically, the inheritance is basically given. If there's a farm involved, he generally always went to the oldest son. Yeah.
This is my grandmother Caroline, my dad.
It's the only picture that I know I actually met that grandmother. I no recollection, but I was about 2 years
You
old.
can't read this caption, but this is look here. Knut and
This is
my dad and Odd Stark. On the fjord, and the caption says,
well. When it took several hours to clean this thing up and get this together, and I found this photo last night. I've been looking for it for
I've never
years.
seen it before.
And when I saved the photo, it said when fish were scared. These are some this guy fought the war with a fishing pole and walked through Europe with a fishing pole because he would fish any chance he got. I suppose he ate well that way too. Fresh fish.
He fished Panama Canal, he fished in Japan, he fished he was a diehard fisherman.
And his daughter lives in Kindred, our cousin.
He's got stuff I haven't seen, so.
We had friends in Lilac, they were Odd Osterroot, and they named their son Odd Osterroot, so they had Odd and a little Odd.
My odd uncle, Odd Gjovik, married Norma Muller, and he would introduce himself and said, "I'm Odd, and she's normal." That's, our family is teachers. My sister is a teacher, Pete's a teacher, I was a teacher, my older brother was a school superintendent.
He was a teacher too.
Teacher too, yeah. They called us my master's thesis. So, 40 years as a pastor, and that's enough.
I will close with this. One time I asked Dad, I said, how could you, after seeing Norway, how could you leave such a beautiful country and leave everything behind and come and be a dirt farmer, not knowing how to milk a cow? Mom knew how to milk cows. And I expected out because he became a landowner, because he, get these opportunities. That's what I was expecting, So it was a loaded question. And he looked me right in the eye and he says, all my children will have college degrees. That man had a library that would have been an envy of many academic professors. First edition, 1800s. I mean, he was a voracious reader, probably had, about a 7th grade? Maybe 8th grade education from Norway, but just well-read. Unbelievable.
The best English teacher that they ever had in Nelson County was Vera Bliss. And when her estate came up for auction, he bought her library.
He bought her library for $20. I think I still have back problems because of that one.
But I mean, he read Plutarch's Republic. He read everything he could get his hands on. And then it just said something. He would sit down with us in the evenings in front of the coal stove and read Robinson Crusoe and Tom Sawyer.
He was basically deaf. You think about working in a mine and blowing dynamite, and then in your second vocation, you drive John Deere 2-lung tractor, right? So his hearing was shot. So reading was what he could do.
I think it's genetic, because if I take out my hearing aids, I'm as deaf as a post.
Any questions? We've been terribly long-winded.
I was just curious, what age did they start school back then, when we were in Norway?
Same as here. My brother he started in the 1st grade and he'd gone through 3 years in Norway. And he went 1st grade, 2nd grade. He graduated. He was an old senior, but he was the valedictorian. And my odd uncle, he came from Norway, 19 years old. And he went up to Bergen Township #1, sat in the classroom with the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. When he got so that he knew what the 8th graders were talking about, he moved to Bismarck and started work. I mean, it was important to command English. Very important. So, yeah,
When you were still in Norway, then were you?
I did not go to school in Norway. My brother did. He was 3 years older than I was. So, I was muted.
When I started school, I spoke a mixture of English and Norwegian, didn't know the difference. We used them interchangeably at home. And Mrs. Martinson, I had her for 3 years, and I didn't flunk once. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade. Or I should say, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade. Third. Right? And she always used to tell a story about me. You know how when you're learning how rhymes work, right? And they had 4 things, and you're supposed to pick the 3 things that rhyme. There was a nail, a pail, a snail, and something else I don't remember. Well, I got the pail, and I got the snail, but I circled something else because I knew that other one didn't rhyme, because that was a speaker, which is Norwegian for nail.
Did they teach English? Your older brother went to 3rd grade in Norway. Did they teach English then?
No, they didn't start teaching them in language in 4th, 5th grade. We had to teach
Okay.
language, yeah.
Cause I
Oh,
know,
we could tell stories about it.
Back in the sixties, I think, is when they really
Now,
started.
now they
in-
do, but.
Oh, they started them in kindergarten and first grade,
Yeah.
learning English.
They speak better English than we do.
They speak the King's English there.
After you got your F, what was your grade the next semester?
Well, I still got the report card up.
Realize what the.
Oh, you know what? It's the first time I saw a teacher cry. She put her head down and she just bawled. But they didn't change it very much. Still,
I bet you got better grade next time.
I think so.
so like when the war was going, when the Nazis would come into your houses and stuff, did they have anything against women, or were they, you know what I mean? So was your mom pretty safe from the Nazis?
Well, my mother,
Treat the women.
all I know is that my mother literally shook from fear.
She was protecting her children, I'm sure.
Hey, they bombed and there's no Germans were shot or no Germans, the dogs were licking the blood off the road. I mean, it was bad. It was bad. And I can still hear they marched and those clicks they made those, was not good. It was a Gestapo. Yeah, I'll tell you, this one's a story you need to hear. I'm sitting out in the sandbox with my brother and my sister. We had a square sandbox right outside the kitchen door on the farm. And we used the separator rings. That was our tools. And every once in a while, when the regular soldiers would come by, we'd come in, see the kids, and they'd come over and play with us in the sandbox. Tears running down their cheeks. I could never figure it out. It got to be older over here, and then I started realizing what was going on. These soldiers had their own kids back home, and they missed them so bad they came to play with us. It wasn't the Gestapo that did that. That was the foot soldiers.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it wasn't easy for them either. Yeah.
Do you have all this stuff written down?
We,
I hope.
we're gonna.
We
try
talk
to-
about it.
If nothing else, you need to start recording when you do these presentations.
We need to write it and publish it, because there's a lot.
Yeah. Well, you were just at our church a couple of weeks ago, at our Savior's.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You know, I think one of the things that really sticks with me is one of my conversations with Dad. And I had asked him, I said, you must be really tough. We've got lots of German neighbors and German descendants, and very difficult. And he said, don't kid yourself, the Germans are good people. It's fascism that is the problem.
Yeah.
He says there was a lot of soldiers that were there. They had one choice, fight or die. If you fight, maybe you live to another day. If you don't fight, you're a dead man anyway. They had no choice.
That shortwave radio was the death sentence. I heard Roosevelt, I heard Stalin, and I heard Hitler. As a little kid, I know what their voices sounded like.
Oh, you heard Churchill too, didn't you?
Yeah, Winston Churchill.
Yeah, right?
Yeah. I mean, for me, what's going on in the Ukraine, those people are unbelievable. But you know what? You can only kill somebody so long. I mean, it doesn't do much good to kick a dead horse. They feel they're dead. We're not going to let this happen. I admire them greatly. I don't know. I would hate to be someone to try to attack the Americans as uppity as we are in some ways about war. I think we wouldn't be easy to handle. I'm a pastor, and I know that I would put it this way, if somebody threatened my kids, I'd protect them. I'm not Christ, I'm the first one to admit it, but, you know, we are our own worst enemies. And anybody who knows me, I act like a normal person, I don't preach at you. Right, Joe? Yeah.
I have one other question, because you said that on the radio, you like heard Hitler, the order addresses, so like, what kind of stuff did he say?
Oh my.
I mean, like,
He was all about the people and the might of the people and the evil of Judah, of the evil of the Jews. Yeah, he was awful.
And well,
Norway,
what-
that stuff was broadcast?
He was, yeah, they broadcast, if Hitler was speaking, it would come on the shortwave all over the world.
What's interesting is Hitler had Jewish blood in his lineage. A lot of people don't know that.
Yeah. I kind of hinted at it, but Wiesenberg, the nuclear scientist in Germany, was a Jew. And they allowed him to continue because they knew that his intelligence was what they critically needed. But he never finished the project. He was brilliant. Brilliant. Yeah.
He never finished because he knew ways to stall or what?
Well, you've got to take a look at the Norwegians did that. Oh yes, he's fantastic. He's so shrewd. You know, I don't know. People are clever under dire circumstances. I go to Hustfest as often as I can. One of the authors, her last name is Scott, and she wrote about the 12th man. She's written a lot of Norwegian word accounts. And I got to know her, and I said, one time I said, you've got to write about Flekkefjord. She said, what do you mean? Well, I said, there's a story there that needs to be told. And she said, well, there was sabotage that happened in Flekkefjord. That's a city right over the mountain, not too far from where my dad grew up in Peder. And the Gestapo took the parents of the soccer team, had them dig a ditch. And then they lined up their sons and shot them and buried them. No more sabotage. Now, so she goes to Norway. They wouldn't talk about it. It was buried forever. But she got wind of a double agent and wrote a book about the double agent. I forget the name of it, but it's incredible.
And what was her name?
Her last name was Scott. She's from Seattle. She had cancer. I don't know if she's still alive or not, but
Do you know what her first name is?
my 80 is catching up to me. But Scott, let's see, Defiant Courage is one of her books. Defiant Courage. That's another incredible story.
So did your folks get good at speaking English then?
My dad was pretty good. My mother was half English and half Norwegian. I just looked at a letter today that she wrote from Norway for my wife's birthday to congratulate her, and it was half Norwegian and half English. Very readable.
I'm trying to learn Norwegian now, so.
Well, Norwegian and German is Samesboga. It's another story. I was an interim specialist for 4 years. I worked for the bishop in troubled situations and went to a congregation, and they met with me for about 5 hours, and they told me I had to interview and take the call. And after I took the call, the congregation was a 115-year-old Swedish church. 27 nobles. Bishop said, "You're taking the call." So I accepted the call, and after the meeting was over, when one of the elders of the church, his wife was the organist, and he was he came up to me and he poked me here, and he said, just remember, he said, you're a Norwegian. And you know what I did? I answered him in my finest Oslo dialect, which is Swedish. I said, "Ikke noe for skyld." He never bothered me again. He said, "There's no difference." I thought you was joking. You don't forget there's Norwegian. Well,
You guys did wonderful.
we do have plans to put it all together, because it's amazing. Stories coming here, and education, you know, yeah. Yes.
The Atlantic Crossing, you mentioned several movies, and I'm wondering how you liked that one.
Which one?
The Atlantic Crossing.
Oh,
You know, when I watched it, I enjoyed it. You know, of course, there's two sides to every story. You know, and it's like, oh, you know, FDR and the love interest with the Princess of Norway and this sort of thing. But I thought I found it very interesting.
we don't know the insides.
We don't really know. But we do know that there were some very positive things that came out of it for Norway.
So the king was directing kind of the war effort from England then?
From England, yes.
Okay. And so
The-
that
the-
part was accurate?
Oh yeah, the princess was with the kids in the United States,
Yeah.
and Crown Prince Olaf was in England with King Haakon. If you get a chance to see that, the king's
King's choice.
choice in Norwegian, it's Kongens nei, the king's refusal or the king's no, when he tells them that, you know, if you don't fight the Nazis, we abdicate. You know, that's pretty. It's kind of interesting. I mean, it pushed the cabinet over the center where they said, okay, we're gonna put up a fight. Northern Norway was holding its own. There's a new movie coming out I haven't seen yet called Narvik. And the British were in there and they were holding their own. They were actually pushing the Nazis back, and then the Brits decided that it just wasn't defensible and they pulled out and they kind of got left hanging.
When the war was over, Germany, from Spitsbergen all the way down almost to Trondheim, burned everything. Everything.
Yes.
Destroyed everything.
But I can also remember Dad telling the stories about the German equipment. I said, what about all that equipment that they left behind, like skis and stuff? We piled it up and we burned it. And they didn't want anything to do with it.
Oh, there's a lot of stories to tell.
So was Oslo still was that the capital at that time, or was?
Pardon?
Is Oslo the capital of Norway?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So was Oslo?
Yep.
Was
That's
That
where-
was where it all-
that's where
Yep.
Quisling, the Norwegian trader who was a Nazi, that's where he headquartered, was in Oslo.
Oh,
Yeah. And they had their prison there, that's where they operated out of Oslo. Yeah.
so how far away from you was that? Was that?
Let's see, 4 hours driving time, yeah. We're in the southern part, if the map I could show you, but Norway is kind of fat at the bottom, and on the right-hand side where it gets up to Sweden, that's where Oslo is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Christiania in the old days, you know.
So Norway, as far as, I've never been there, I don't know, on my bucket list I'd love to go, but, that's not near as big as the United States, right?
Oh, Lord.
What-
North
like, it's
Dakota,
like what
North
state
Dakota
is
has
it?
almost as much land as Norway.
Okay,
Norway's
that's what I was
1,500
wondering.
miles long,
Yep.
but,
And it's like this.
yeah. What,
3% of Norway is tillable land. The rest is rock and trees.
and big
Water.
And sheep.
I got a bad joke about that.
I think there's more more Norwegians in Minnesota than there is in Norway. Yeah. But that's not unusual for a lot of countries. You know, I have some stories to tell about some wonderful Russian people too, czars and connections and whatever. But it's funny once you pick up over life's work.
From what Joe was saying earlier, I think he's eyeing that lefse over there.
It could be, but that's true.
I think they.
Well, you're sure. Well,
If there isn't any other questions, I thank you.